the first mute, a lot of times you see charts with the composers that are taking courses at USC, or we do stuff for UCLA Extension. I contract 3 or 4 classes for different teachers, and you'll see somebody write something. It will just say the word mute, and I got 8 mutes right there. So sometimes they say, well, what do you have? And I say, I have 8 mutes. The default mute is a straight mute, and a metal straight mute is very buzzy and supposed to be bitey. Right? So I mean, Scheherazade, super buzzy, super metal. So then straight up straight mute, and then there's versions of that are fiber, which is, back in the day they didn't do metal. This one's much mellower. It's got a wood bottom to it, and it's made out of fiber. So that one's not quite as bitey. So sometimes you got to use your own head as a player on a session. If it's a quieter thing in the cue, you're not going to play your loudest straight mute. So I'll pull out this fiber mute. I won't even tell the composer what I'm pulling out, and then I'll use that. I have a plastic straight mute, modern day, plays great. It can be bright, but it's also very mellow. So I mean, old jazz in a straight mute is, Louis Armstrong big time, 1929. Right. So the default thing on a film score thing, mute, is going to be a straight mute. Mellow cup mutes, standard looking mute, goes on the horn. You can use it for classical stuff. Jazz. So you definitely, that big band sound, that cup thing, lots of vibrato, standard cup mute. I have a cup mute that has an adjustable cup, one that goes up and down, and I can change the brightness of it. I can put it right against the horn, and if somebody says cup mute like Dizzy Gillespie, right? So that's much mellower than that other cup that I pulled out. And so an adjustable cup has to be part of your arsenal if you're a trumpet player, for sure. And then we have the money mute, the solo tone mute. It's the double tiered 1920s. If it says 1920s on a part, you're going to use this mute straight away. And then it also has the end, which has an opening to it where you can wah it. Right? So then the end of a solo tone mute, you can wah that as well. So somebody was asking about Spike Jones, all that comedy stuff. Right? So it's almost like the wah that we do is almost like talking. It's a conversation. Yeah. So you can do that with a solo tone. You can obviously do that with a plunger. I have spent more than $1 on a plunger mute. They make, modern day mute companies make fancy plastic.
Waste of money.
I know. This doesn't come with a stick. It's like, I probably spent $40 on this piece of plastic. It probably costs $1, right? So it does play better than a hardware store plunger. Is it $45 better? No. my hand. Yeah, it's harder than a regular toilet plunger. It's a little harder. You know, there's a friend of mine in New York's coming out with a real one that's been tested and tuned and what do you call it, a 3D printed. It's like, you know, I get it. Harmon mute with a stem is definitely a 20s mute again. It sounds a lot like that solo tone. So that's going to be used stem in. A lot of times if you're writing for it, as a writer, you need to be specific if you want a Harmon mute with a stem in or stem out. Stem out is Miles Davis. Everybody, well, I'm not going to say everybody because there's people on here that maybe haven't written for the trumpet yet. So then Miles Davis. So it's that buzzy, buzzy, buzzy Harmon mute, no stem. Okay? Yep. Miles Davis, no stem. We have a bucket mute, which makes, it's got felt in it, and it makes it super mellow, and it will say on the part bucket, and they've been using them since the 40s. And it's literally playing into foam, is exactly that. And then typically you're going to have a whole section doing that at the same time. Right. And then here in the studio, you know, if it's a solo thing, I might give a guy, if it's a solo line and it's a 20s thing, I might give him a solo tone, a straight mute, and a cup mute in 3 options in 3 separate tracks. And you kind of know when you're tracking something, if it sits in the track the right way and you have an impression of what it is. And if the composer just wrote mute 1920s, I can either ask him by text, hey, what do you want here? Or he'll say, I don't know, what do you think? And then you pretty much know after you record one of them if it fits the sonic texture of that cue. And then, so, but I always give options, you know, absolutely.
There's an interesting question here about the origins of these mutes, and I imagine that's all over the place where some of them
you know what?
came up.
I think there was metal straight mutes back in the end of the 1800s for orchestral literature, and only that. I think there's mutes in Mahler and things like that, and they were probably metal or fiber. They were probably fiber first. I mean, there was lathes making metal. And then I think it was I don't know. I mean, like there's probably trumpet players that have doctorates and they had to do their thesis on the evolution of mutes. I mean, I'm sure there's stuff out there.
Back in the 20s, these guys were all big fans of the classical composers, but they were tasked with writing music for a local ensemble. And the local ensemble could have any number of people in it. So, for instance, vaudeville was big in those days, and people would show up with charts, like singers would show up with charts that they had just purchased that didn't even match the ensemble that was sitting in the pit. And the musicians in those days, one of my old doctors in Santa Monica had been a violin player in a pit band in a casino serving illegal drinks during Prohibition. And he said, in those days, they would bring in charts that would have nothing to do with what the singer was singing. They would have to read the trumpet part and transpose it to whatever key the singer wanted in. So there was an entire group of people with an enormous skill set. But these arrangers back then were listening to the classical composers, and they didn't have string sections. They didn't have wind sections. So what they wanted was a way to make the big band or the brass band sound in a bunch of different ways. And the way they did that to make it sound softer or prettier was a cup mute. They wanted it to sound in the distance. They'd use a straight mute. And Duke Ellington and some of the people about that time came up with ways to make things sound demonic. And so you ended up with your Harmon mutes and your Pixie mutes and, you know, and things of that nature. But they were really just trying to increase the tone color palette of the brass band. And they did that with woodwinds and the saxes and mutes in the brass section.
So, Chris, we have a request from 3 different people asking if you could put the Harmon mute back in and hear you play it with the stem half out.
Yeah, so all the way in is that rubber ducky kind of sound. Half out, well, still in, and it's harder to wah-wah with it, but it does get a different sound. Right, so then here's halfway. So the closer you get to the all the way in is the real, I mean, like, here's the one thing when I do gigs and other trumpet players show up with me in a 20s gig and I'm lead trumpet, it'll say Harmon, and I have to tell the other trumpet player if they haven't done a 20s gig, it's Harmon with the stem in, because they'll automatically just pull out their Harmon like it's Davis. No, it's 1932, 20s and 30s. So it's stem in, and half the trumpet players don't have a stem. They threw the stem out or it's at home. And it's when it says Harmon in vintage stuff, 20s and 30s. 40s, they were pulling the stem out. It was already out, not for everything, but if it says Harmon in a part from 19, I have a 20s band that I work with all the time with Jim. If it says if it's a 20s or 30s tune, it says Harmon, it is stem all the way in.
Okay.
Yeah, and you'll hear those old recordings on the 78s with that. So then it gets almost as buzzy as the Miles Davis, but not quite.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's a pretty cool sound. And usually the music will say Harmon, stem in, pulled out. Many times it'll say that.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, and it's a trumpet player thing. Your brass players have to tell you about these things. It's not an automatic thing, you know. Yeah.